4 years ago, it was 2018, we had what was called a historic framework with actionable steps. The social partners coming out and saying, we now have a clear and direct plan to address the staggering unemployment, which at the time was sitting at 27.2%. It's now sitting at 35.3%. It's the other direction. It's the wrong way around. Okay, there's been a COVID, there's been other things, but is this plan with 22 actions failing to do what it's supposed to do, and why?
Thanks. A very good evening to you, Thabo, and to the other panelists. And it's been nice to say hi to all of them behind the scenes. I think that it's really important to do from time to time, as you have just done, to reach back to history and to remind us of the commitments, of the plans, and of the promises, because in essence, these are not just words. These are actually promises that leadership makes to people in South Africa. The promise is, it might be bad now, but it will get better. Hang in there. And people have been hanging in. And the problem is that things have not been getting better. Now, for many of us, firstly, I just want to say we don't use the narrow definition of unemployment. In my institute, we only use the broad definition because that includes people who've given up looking for jobs. We believe that they should also be recognized as unemployed because they are not employed. So when you were talking about 35.3% of unemployment, the broad definition is 46%. And it's important to recognize the millions of people that signifies. So what I want to say, just for my opening sort of conversational point, and I really am pleased that we have time to discuss with each other, is that the situation is incredibly dire. It was, and remember, this is the last quarter of 2021, so this hasn't had the impact of the most recent Eskom electricity blackouts. This is the season that's meant to really be the festive season where retail is up and things like that. We can look later on in the show at sectors that have lost jobs. I think for me an interesting point, and it really is about trying to find sense in statistics. You look at the difference between the unemployed, the narrow definition, which increased to the highest ever since 2008 by 0.4%, and the expanded definition, which dropped to 46.2%, and it dropped by 0.4%. To my mind, one of the meanings that this might have is that people have stopped not looking for jobs. So in other words, unemployed people, more unemployed people, have actually started looking for jobs than before. And this is, a lot of this is just trying to make sense, as I said, of the figures. And I wonder whether this is not because of the social relief of distress grant, that 350 Rand grant that was paid to people who are unemployed or working age for the first time, whether this adds to a mobility and is a positive statement of people trying to find their way through the labor market. It's a terrible, terrible situation of unemployment for youth, for women, for provinces across the country. But that was one glimmer which I thought would be, hopefully, have a story to it. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Chifi, let's bring you in here. You are sharing that sentiment. I mean, we are what is called an industrial economy, but we have very poor absorption. Others are saying even the lowest labor absorption rate in the world. But is this, if you look at the broad definition and if you look at the official definition of unemployment, a sign that those who had given up are now beginning to look for work again?
Well, the numbers are showing this kind of trend, but I think I want to go into the household to say if I am a parent and I'm raising my children, I must the message that the statistics is telling me here is that I must be telling my kid that no, if you're looking for a job, you must first of all ensure that you are a graduate. Because the guarantee of having a job when you have got matric or less matric, not having a job are very high, because they start telling us that no, if you don't have a matric, you fall in the category of 51.6%. While if you got a matric, you fall in the category of 38.6% in terms of unemployment. But if you are a graduate, you are falling within the 2.4%. So that's a clear message on the parenthood point of view of what someone can pick up from the figures here. I think you touch on the subject of sectoral approach towards this. It's really always disappointing to note that manufacturing sector is continuing to shed jobs. 85% of the jobs are being shed in the manufacturing sector. And yet this is a sector which was quite massive in terms of job creation in the early 90s, almost close to 25% contribution towards the GDP. We are now sitting at 11.6% towards the GDP contribution of the manufacturing sector. And that trend, as long as that trend continues to go down in terms of contribution of the manufacturing sector, we will never see massive employment in the South African economy. And obviously the challenges that those sectors are facing, for instance, it's quite clear where government can actually be able to manage, but the issue is to say, have that been managed? For example, electricity supply, the manufacturing sector. It's one of the key components required in terms of production. The cost of electricity itself has been rising quite aggressively. So if you look at from the point of attracting investment into the economy, when you are selling the country, you look at, first of all, are the cost base of your industrial landscape competitive? Currently, we're not competitive with other countries. So that actually is diminishing our potential for economy to create jobs, for instance, in the manufacturing sector. So those areas, I think, need to be taken as a priority from government in terms of addressing the challenges that we are facing with regard to the supply patterns of energy and also the cost patterns of energy. But also, one of the things that the statistics is telling me is that if I'm raising girls in my family, it is also telling me that the chances of them having jobs are very rare, because women, the unemployment have what they face here. The face of unemployment is on the women's side, 38.2%. The face of unemployment in the country is also having a gender approach, which is almost close to, African population, you are talking about 39.1%. And also it's got a face of youth, which I can define the age group, 66.5%. So those are areas where when you are trying to bring in policy, obviously the focus of intervention is to address those specific segments of our population which is facing unemployment, but also having a broader approach towards how do we industrialize the South African economy from the manufacturing-based point of view.
All right. What is the link between business enterprises in the country and the failure to create employment, but also what is the link between the DNA of the economy of this country and this failure to create employment? Gilad, I'll give that to you.
Evening, thanks. It's quite a large question there, but I think that it's a good one because it says what structural factors in our economy lead us to where we are now. One of them has been mentioned already, which is the continued shedding of employment in our manufacturing sector, whereas actually between the end of last year and the Q3, we saw some employment gains in a number of other sectors. It was in manufacturing where we saw 85,000 jobs lost, but between those quarters. And it's really in that sector where we're seeing least recovery. And what that's indicating is an erosion of the industrial base of our economy. And that remains a critical weakness. I think we're also familiar with a range of other elements holding us back, whether that's the electricity supply, poor infrastructure, corruption, and so on. I would like to mention one other, which is that if we look between 2019, so the end of 2019 and the end of 2021, we see the largest employment lost 528,000 jobs in the so-called community and social sector. And that's where both private and public social services, education, health, but also care work, elderly care, and so on, occurs. And that's a sector in which government's role as an employer is very direct, because that's where our nurses, teachers, and so on are employed. And so what we're actually seeing, and if we look at that, in light of our budget speech last month, what we're seeing is a reduction in government expenditure, a freezing of various posts in the economy, in the public service. And yet that is a sector which is seeing widespread job losses. So in addition to the dynamics of our private sector, it's also important for us to understand how government austerity is exacerbating the unemployment crisis.
Elroy, let's bring you in here as well. I mean, while we're looking at that sectoral approach as far as manufacturing shedding jobs. Now, if we look at that framework agreement of 2018, there was a sectoral commitment to not only boost employment, but job retention as well. And I think there was some commitment to say they will explore every other avenue before shedding jobs. In fact, there was even commitment at looking at the salary packages of top executives and so on and so forth to be able to keep as many jobs as we possibly can. We have not done so. Is there a link there between capital wanting to take profit and the job losses and the inability to secure jobs for the poor working class in the country?
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to share my reflections. I concur completely with the previous speakers, Chifi, Gilad, and Isobel. But I think there's a need to address the elephant in the room, actually. Namely, if you look at the quarterly employment statistics, something that's coming out, was supposed to come out today, but is coming out on Thursday instead. They say, there's a saying that goes, if you cannot measure it, it doesn't exist. I think Lord Kelvin or someone like that used that quote. And it's absolutely pertinent here because the quarterly employment statistics does no disaggregation at all 61 pages of it, of gender. And yet the framework agreement speaks to issues of gender parity. There's quite a section in one of the chapters that talks to gender parity, and it's very worrisome that there is absolutely nothing. I checked and triple checked. If you search for women, female, girl, child, there is nothing. And that is a massive oversight by an institution of the state, namely Stats SA. So I just want to say that this flies against the wisdom of institutions like the International Labour Organization. And if I may very briefly speak about the ILO, that published a paper called Incorporating Gender Issues in Labour Statistics by Adriana Mata-Greenwood. They wrote that the labour force participation of women is lower than that of men, basically in all countries. Still, it has increased over the last decades, while that of men has slightly decreased. Age of women is important. It affects their participation in the labour market, a linking age with their reproductive cycle and associated constraints on women. For men, the effect of age is more uniform across age, indicating lower attachment to family responsibilities. In countries where there is agriculture, where agriculture is not very important, women tend to be concentrated in service occupation while men are more evenly distributed by industry services. The share of women in the informal sector is higher than their share in the labor force, suggesting women turn to the informal sector more often than men because they lack opportunities or they face other obstacles to employment in the formal sector.
Yeah.
Women work shorter hours than men. Unemployment rates of women are higher. They are underrepresented in managerial production, etc., and earn less income than men, even at the same level of explained educational attainment, occupation, and hours of work. And to me, I was absolutely gobsmacked. I was shocked that those statistics is not present in an important publication like the QS. And certainly part of our advocacy at AIDC is to push for that. And I think we'll be having a conversation with the Commission for Gender Equity, etc. It was a shocking oversight.
Right.
Thanks.
Isobel, let's talk maybe about what Elroy is raising there, the informalization of the labor market. Could that not be a contributing factor also in seeing the large number of those who had given up actually looking for employment, that number actually going down, that maybe they have gone to the formal side of this informal side of the economy, and that's where they are currently doing work?
Talbot, thanks for raising it, because it was something that I was going to raise, which was unexpectedly to my analysis, the informal sector number of employed people employed in the informal sector, sorry for my inelegant language, fell by 48,000 people. So, in fact, the go-to reservoir of unemployed people who are trying to fix piece jobs and things like that, because the definition of informal work in the labor force survey is very generous, to the point of if you add value to your house by fixing your house, you're actually included in some of the categorizations as having been employed. So the big question is why? Why is the informal sector shrinking, shedding jobs? And there is some analysis as to where that goes. We know that the construction sector formerly shared jobs as well as manufacturing. But what I did want to raise, because I am aware that we are competing with the clock here, is one of the things that struck me, in addition to the possibility, the positive possibility that the social leave of distress was giving people the ability to become more mobile in the labor market, was the tragedy that long-term unemployment has edged up to a formal 80% of the unemployed. In other words, people who are stuck in unemployment, who are not moving in and out of unemployment. Now, globally, the year-long is a really important marker for people who are less likely to get out of unemployment. So we have a huge problem because people who are in long-term unemployment are not accessing unemployment insurance benefits. They are basically not going to be employed again. We are losing their skills to the labor market, their experience. And also we have adults who are looking around for what they should be doing. Why is the informal economy not providing for them? I do want to raise a category, and hopefully my fellow panelists will talk to this. So this is a bit shy of me to push it in like this. And that's the not an employment, education, or training statistic. In addition to the unemployment figures, there's another slice at looking at people's labor market activity. So not in employment, education, or training, there's 18.7 million people. And the reason I raise this is Chifi was talking about the policy implications of what government should be doing. It's very tempting for the state to say, let's have labor market activation strategies that enable those recently new entrants into the labor market to move into the world of work, such as interns. I was just saying during the break that 2 of my interns have just got permanent employment, which is great for Polani and Duduzo, but not for me. However, what struck me about the NEET category is it's actually the 35 to 44-year-old category, age cohort, who have 25 to 34-year-olds actually have the greatest age cohort of 5.8 million. Then the 35 to 44-year-olds have just under 4 million people in this category. And then the 15 to 24-year-olds have a lower number of 3.5 million, maybe because they're students. But so sorry, it's a long way around of me saying, while we need to look at policies to intervene, in a way the crisis is spread across age cohorts. It's spread across provinces. We see that some of the rural provinces, of course, Eastern Cape and Mpumalanga, and Limpopo, again, really suffering in terms of unemployment. But we need to look at something which is a shock to the unemployment system across the country. We are too far gone in this crisis to say we have time to implement small little patches here and there. We are off the radar in terms of international comparison, and that's why many of us are saying to policymakers, please open your ears. In July, when it comes to policy conference time, we need to have a universal basic income grant. Chifi knows that I always say this, the other two panelists as well, because we need to give people the money to be able to become producers and consumers themselves, not wait for some trickle down. In fact, I was just trying to do the math between the investment conference, the 355 billion, what kind of jobs are they going to be manufacturing? When Chifi tells us the low employment rates of the unemployed, that marriage is not going to happen. We need to enable people to become agents of their own transformation by redistributing income until we manage to fix some of these structural manufacturing and industrial policy factors. Thanks very much.
All right. How do we reprioritize government spending in order to create jobs? We'll look at that further in this moment. But first, though, Statistics South Africa has revealed that the labor market overall remains more favorable to men than to women. The unemployment rate among black women is sitting at 42.4% compared to 36.4% for men. Our reporter Kopana Gumbi takes a look.
The unemployment crisis needs urgent attention. With official stats at the highest in democratic history, the slow GDP growth in sectors like construction and manufacturing are showing in the unemployment numbers. But according to Youth Accelerator Harambe, there are other sectors that could quickly absorb young people.
High potential and high growth. And if you look at digital, that's one of them. I mean, we've identified 66,000 jobs that are currently existing within the digital sector pipeline, right? I think another one that we're seeing is the ECD sector. And we're trying to understand more about how it works and what the opportunities there are. But what we found is that it's a sector in which more women are employed.
Unemployment for black women remains the highest among the gender groups at 42.4%. And for these women, opportunities remain fleeting.
Asinayo imisebenzi, sayifuna imisebenzi, sihlele ezindlini, silambile, siyahlupheka nje siza lapha because of sifuna imisebenzi. I-month end, that's where batho ba bantši ba tla ba tšea batho mo, because most of the people ba tswa mo dintlong tse ba di dulela le mo tsona mo di-townhouses, so ba tla ba hira batho mo ba ba thusa go phaka dilo, and then ra ba thusa ba re patala, ra ba cleanela the empty houses tsona tseo.
Young people and women especially continue to be the most unstable when it comes to job security. And at the current rate, the NDP's goal of halving unemployment by 2030 is out of reach. For Newzroom Afrika on Channel 405, I am Kopana Gumbi in Johannesburg.
All right, Kopana, thank you tonight. Isobel, Frye, Chifi Mhango, Gilad Isaacs, and Elroy. Paulus still with us tonight. Elroy, let me just bring in immediately there. Where are the opportunities for unemployed black South African women for employment currently?
Thank you for that critical question. Minister Enoch Godongwana said that, quote, only through sustained economic growth can South Africa create enough jobs to reduce poverty and inequality, enabling us to reach our goal of a better life for all. Now, our growth rates did not meet our targets. The population is growing at 1.5% when I last checked. And so government is failing its objective. There's also talks that it's not government's duty to create jobs. And I think on so many levels it is failing. However, there are many, many opportunities in my mind, but what it would require is for government to reverse its policy on austerity. You cannot focus on paying extra money to reduce debt and create and impress people who support structural adjustment programs and not focus on the priorities of citizens. That would mean that there needs to be a revision of the current trajectory of austerity. There is enough money to, one, manage our debt, and two, create sustainable, sufficient jobs. And I can think of many, many examples. You have, if you look around in metros, lots of jobs were created with the courier system, with people driving vehicles that are either self-propelled or use dynamos to get across town very fast. Similarly, with community health workers rendering critical services in deep rural areas, why doesn't government employ youth, provide them with sustainable income to assist community health workers and solve many of the structural problems that it is supposed to fulfill in terms of its constitutional obligations? So there are many, many opportunities. But first, what needs to happen is that this view of austerity and an austerity program needs to be revised. That would be the first thing. Thanks.
Gilad, is the idea that economic growth would result in job creation a myth, particularly if we look at this idea of the manufacturing sector, right? One of the two sectors that have done well, if you look at the statistics published 8th of March 2022, manufacturing and transport, they grew by 2.8% and 2.2% in the fourth quarter, respectively. But despite this, we are talking here that these two sectors have shed jobs. One shedding 13,000 jobs, manufacturing shedding a whooping 85,000 jobs. If that growth cannot result in jobs, what would result in job creation?
Thanks. It's not a myth per se that there is a well-founded and evidentially clear relationship between an expansion in the economy, which is what economic growth is, and a increase in employment, right? That's both in South Africa and pretty much in all economies. So the expansion of the economy is a necessary but insufficient condition for employment. The expansion of the economy can mean that it expands in different ways, right? It could be expanding in a way which historically the South African economy is, which is capital intensive, so expanding in sectors which use lots of equipment, machines, and so on, and not expanding in sectors which create employment. It could be expanding in sectors which only create low-wage, precarious employment. Interestingly, the most recent statistics also have a statistics on if the changes in employment are for those with a permanent contract or with a limited contract, as it is called there. And what we're actually seeing is a loss of employment amongst those with previously permanent contracts. But anyway, I digress there. And so, you know, the type of economic activity is going to determine the employment growth and who is being employed in the economy. And what South Africa is failing to be able to achieve is a expansion in areas of the economy which offer both, which are both employment rich and which can offer livable wages. And that brings us back to what Chifi said earlier, which is the importance of manufacturing, but not only in manufacturing, in particular service sectors linked with manufacturing in particular, but in retail, in logistics, as well as various primary sectors like agriculture, which can feed in, to the other sectors of the economy.
Yeah. Chifi, before we go to break, maybe a quick one from you. Is there a way in which the public spend can be reprioritized better to support job creation? Better than, I suppose, we're currently doing. One of those areas, as Isobel suggests, is maybe to begin to talk about a basic income grant.
Well, from the public expenditure point of view, I'm an advocate of infrastructure investment. And I think lessons have been learned in terms of how infrastructure investment assisted in terms of growing the South African economy during the time of the World Cup, where we had massive infrastructure investment in the energy sector, massive infrastructure investment, for instance, in the railway system, which is the Gautrain, and also massive infrastructure investment in the stadium that we were actually putting up for the 2010 World Cup. Leading to that process from 2006 to 2010, we saw the construction sector actually booming in the South African economy. That also helped the manufacturing sector also to have a boom, because there were some products which were actually required to be supplied into that construction sector. For example, the steel industry was actually doing very well at that time. So infrastructure remains quite key in that element in terms of job creation. But what we have seen now is since the completion of most of those World Cup projects or energy projects, we've also seen a decline in terms of construction activity from the GDP point of view, but we have also seen a decline in terms of growth pattern in the South African economy. There was a time when the South African economy was actually growing relatively between 3 and 5%. That was between 2006 and 2010. That has eased since the easing of construction activities. So construction remains key. But obviously, it has to be linked up with the local procurement of the construction material for the local producers. That is the best way in which we can continue to revive the South African economy to support the local producers in terms of the key carbon infrastructure investments.
Let's tackle then the question of skills development, Isobel. I mean, are we creating a pipeline of future skills, or is that something that is too further down the line? We need something that is a little bit more immediate right now, or should we be doing the two at the same time?
Thanks, Thabo. And just very briefly, I think that it's never a false binary. It's not an either or. We certainly do need to be investing in skills, but I think the question that my fellow panelists have been raising previously in response to your questions before the break was we need to know what kind of skills we need. And for that, we need to have a clear idea of the kinds of competitive advantages that we want in order to promote our drive on manufacturing and industrial policies. One of the things that I want to put in here, however, is I think with the Ukraine-Russian war up north, one of the things that's very clear is how interlinked negatively our economy is. And I'm not suggesting go for complete isolationism, but can we not be producing more of our food locally? Can we not be looking to the Africa free trade and looking at cross-border kinds of specialization in terms of Zimbabwe growing food, looking at Angola oil. In South Africa and Zimbabwe, we've got high levels of platinum, we've got gold and palladium, these kind of commodities that are looking at what National Treasury calls a sort of unexpected windfall. For instance, firstly, we must be garnering as much revenue as we can and taxing that. I think ring-fencing that for a sovereign wealth fund against future disasters. So I have gone very far from your question, Papa. I acknowledge that. But what I'm trying to say is we need to be skilling once we know what we need the skills for. Chifi gave us the statistics on the returns on education. Very, very, very low numbers of graduates are unemployed. Very high numbers of people who without primary, secondary, tertiary, and secondary completed. But what I'm asking is that in the medium to longer term, we need to be looking at our competitive advantages. Labour costs are not something we want to ever be competing on. Yeah. I'm a National Minimum Wage Commissioner. For us, it's really important to be reversing the apartheid slave wages through minimum wages, but it means that we're not going to be trying to reduce that as an input cost. So we need to be looking at there are many things that can be done. We have not seen them being done. Chifi talked about the kind of energy and enthusiasm and vision during the FIFA World Cup. We've got it. But we need to see that time is marching. And we need to be looking at what we can do to ensure that people's lives are improved today so that they can be caught into the vision for tomorrow. Thank you.
Elroy, I saw you agreed very strongly to the question of substantial increase in domestic demand, meaning that companies, government, consumers must all buy local and join the buy local circle.
True, I agree with Isobel, but I think the pressing issue is the reversal of the decisions that has been made by the Treasury. If you look at the calculations, Treasury's own calculations and AIDC calculations with the assistance of Dr. Dick Forsland, senior economist, health has been cut in real terms by almost 12%. Basic education, 7%. Social protection, 12.9%. The social wage in real terms is 8.1%. We are, unfortunately, on a disastrous economic and political trajectory, one that austerity and tokenistic social support cannot rescue us from. So what we need are radical progressive alternatives centered on decent health and education, the right to work, the right to say no, a basic income grant, and large functional public sector focused on the provision of public goods. I'm afraid that reversal is necessary for us to move forward.
How do we seize, Gilad, the opportunities presented by what Isobel is also raising, the regional integration and the establishment of the Africa Free Trade Agreement?
Yeah, I think those do offer opportunities. And whilst I certainly agree with the importance of the provision of public services, the need for us to see an expansion in public goods and services, it is in private sector employment where the majority of employment is, and where employment growth also needs to be accelerated. And the regional opportunities which you mentioned are very important. South Africa needs to leverage its strategic advantages, and one of those is the most industrialized economy in Africa, with in theory good ports and the ability to have significant infrastructure which could export goods from South Africa to the region, as well as contribute to the expansion of our neighboring economies. We should not view regional integration as like a zero-sum game where it's about us acquiring market share at the expense of others. It's about the expansion of economic activity in the region. And we see that in a range of supply chains. South Africa is well poised to expand its exports regionally. What unfortunately we have is both trade barriers still, the uneven implementation of the free trade agreement, as well as the fact that that agreement itself has various blind spots, including in accommodating in a more progressive way the informal sector. But what we also have is a series of non-trade barriers, of insufficient infrastructure across Africa. If one can't move goods through rail systems and so on, it's impossible. And so what we really need to see is a continent-wide strategy for the improvement of that economic and social infrastructure.
Right. Chifi, how do we take advantage of two areas now? From a parent point of view, the opportunity given by, of course, the technical skills required in industrial economies, and then two, the regional integration.
I think on the regional integration, Africa, the continent as itself, offers wide range of opportunities. I've worked in the metals and engineering sector, so the steel sector in specific, and one of the trade patterns you see is only on the African region, in terms of trade, do we have a positive net trade balance. In the rest of the other regions where we're trading with, we're actually on the negative side. So it tells you that for us to expand, especially on the manufactured goods from the steel industry or metals industry in specific, the African continent offers wide range of opportunities because it's an area, it's a country or region which is growing from the infrastructure investment that is going on across the continent. That's an area where we need much more intelligence from the government to support the industry in terms of expanding across the continent into the new areas where we never used to export. That's something I think we need to take advantage of, utilizing the African Free Trade Agreement. On the area of the skills requirement, I think it's something that it's being done, but I think in a more a snail pace. We have to speed up that process. So I'll take you back to the metals engineering sector. It is a sector where when you go to a plant, you actually see a serious aging workforce. And what's also going on is that when it comes to feeding in the youth into that sector, the youth are not actually attracted to be in that sector. I mean, I work in the bank. I've seen a situation where, for instance, some of the youth who are actually graduated as engineers are working in the banks because they don't want to work in what can be defined as a data industry. So it is something that I think we need to also work on in terms of education for the youth to realize that these kind of sectors are actually also good from the pay rise point of view, and also they are lucrative in terms of a sustainability for jobs. Because where we're going now currently is that the gap where we're seeing the aging workforce, there is no pipeline of the youth into the metals engineering sector. So government needs to play a more critical role in terms of educating the youth, and also from the youth, also in terms of internship programs need to be intensified in these kind of sectors.